Is this some kind of joke? That bench is reserved, the voice was sharp, laced with the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a life without consequence. Slicing through the crisp autumn air on the university quad, a space meticulously manicured for the day's solemn commemoration. Yet the old man didn't flinch as he sat on the polished oak bench, a small island of stillness in a sea of bustling preparation. His clothes a patchwork of faded grays and washed-out blues, a jacket that had seen too many winters and trousers worn thin at the knees, while beside him an ancient canvas rucksack slumped like a tired old dog, its straps frayed and its color lost to sun and time. As the young man who had spoken, Julian, stood with his hands on his hips, his tailored blazer a stark contrast to the old man's weary attire, saying, "Did you hear me, old-timer? Reserved. For distinguished guests, that means not you," and gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the small, elegantly engraved brass plaque on the bench, while the old man's eyes, pale watery blue, slowly lifted from the ground to meet Julian's without anger or fear, only a profound and unsettling calmness, as if he were observing a mildly interesting weather pattern, and he didn't speak, simply holding the young man's gaze with slow, even breathing, a quiet counterpoint to the student's agitated energy, a silence that infuriated Julian more than any retort as it refused to engage on his terms and rejected the power he believed he wielded, while two more students, acolytes from Julian's circle of privilege, drifted over, drawn by the scent of a conflict they could safely observe. One of them a girl with a pearl necklace and an expression of curated disgust, wrinkling her nose and saying, "Honestly, Julian, just call security. The smell is affecting the atmosphere," as she fanned the air with a manicured hand. Yet the old man's gaze remained fixed on Julian, his posture unchanging as he sat perfectly straight, with his back not quite touching the bench's support. A subtle discipline completely at odds with his derelict appearance. His hands resting on his knees, gnarled and scarred but still, not trembling with age or infirmity, a coiled stillness about him. A predatory patience deeply unnerving to anyone who knew what to look for. Though the students saw only what they expected, a vagrant, a piece of social debris sullying their perfect day, prompting Julian to announce with rising pitch, performing for his small audience, "I'm trying to be civil, but if you're deaf or just stupid, I'll have you physically removed. This day is about honoring heroes, not coddling the homeless. Now get up and get out," to which the old man responded only by slowly blinking. A deliberate reptilian motion, still saying nothing. His silence a void that Julian desperately poured his arrogance into, unaware it was swallowing him whole. As for a fraction of a second, the old man's attention shifted, and his eyes scanned the perimeter of the quad with automatic, instinctual efficiency, not just looking but assessing and cataloging. A ghost of a habit from a life lived on a razor's edge. All of it observed from 50 yards away by Captain Daniel Hayes of the 75th Ranger Regiment as he watched the scene unfold with a knot of irritation tightening in his stomach, knowing he was here as a liaison, a glorified usher for the brass, and that the last thing he needed was a public disturbance. His first instinct to stride over and support the smug student, because university policy was university policy and the bench was in fact reserved. Yet he hesitated, held back not by pity but by a flicker of professional recognition burned into his subconscious by years of training reading people, dissecting body language for threats and intent in the crowded markets of Baghdad and the desolate villages of Afghanistan, seeing past the tattered clothes to the spine straight as a rifle barrel, the constant subtle swivel of the head, the eyes never resting on one point for more than a second, the classic sign of hypervigilance, and the feet planted flat on the ground, not casually crossed, but positioned for a stable base ready to move. The posture and habits not of a man broken by the streets, but the ingrained cellular level disciplines of a warrior. as cold curiosity replaced Hayes's annoyance, and he walked closer with a more cautious, observational rhythm, his eyes cataloging details that could mean life or death. Noticing the scuffed and cracked boots with laces tied in a perfect non-slip reef knot. A small detail taught in basic training but perfected only through years of field use. And then the rucksack, an old Alice pack, military issue from a bygone era faded to pale olive drab, with a small crudely stitched patch attached by blackened paracord. So faded and grimy it was almost invisible, a mere ghost of color and thread. Yet as Hayes squinted he made out the silhouette of a skull. Not the boisterous emblem of a biker gang, but something more severe and archaic, beneath it a single spectral wing. Stealing his breath as he remembered whispered legends told by grizzled instructors at SEER School of a unit so deep in the black, its operators were listed as killed in action the day they joined. Called the Ghosts, a myth, a campfire tale. Something that couldn't be real, and yet there was the marker, sending a current of ice and electricity up his spine as he truly looked at the old man and saw the truth beneath the grime and wrinkles. The hard economy of motion, the absolute control of his space. Realizing he was looking at a living legend while these children treated him like garbage. Just as Julian snapped, "That's it. I've had enough of this." Pulled out his phone, called campus security. Announced his name and his father's position on the board of trustees. Reported a belligerent vagrant refusing to move from the reserved bench for the commemoration ceremony. And snapped the phone shut with a flourish of finality. The word belligerent hung in the air, a ridiculous lie that highlighted the absurdity of the situation, because the old man hadn't moved a muscle and was the very picture of placid stillness. And a few minutes later a campus security guard, a portly man named Henderson, whose authority came more from his uniform than his presence, ambled over and assessed the situation with a lazy glance, his eyes lingering on Julian's expensive shoes, and then on the old man's tattered coat. His decision made before a word was spoken, as he said, "All right. Pop, you heard the man," his voice in tired official drone. "Time to move along. This area is closed for the event." And the old man's pale blue eyes shifted to the guard, though he still didn't speak. His gaze heavy with a weight the guard couldn't comprehend, prompting Henderson to snap, "Are you deaf?" I said, "Get up now," as he reached out and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. A gesture meant to be firm, but which in this context was an act of profound desecration. All of it seen by Captain Hayes, who felt a primal urge to intervene, to slam the guard against the nearest oak tree. But he was frozen between the man he was and the uniform he wore, thinking what could he possibly do? Step in and say that this homeless man was a mythical Black Ops soldier and should be left alone, knowing they would think he was insane. That as an active duty captain causing a scene and contradicting campus security over a vagrant could have career-ending repercussions and earn the wrath of his commanding officer. And what if he was wrong and it was all just coincidence? The posture, the knot, the patch he thought he recognized, making him fear he would look like a fool. As deep, burning shame filled him for standing there as a ranger sworn to protect, while a man who might be one of the founding fathers of his profession was being humiliated by a child and a glorified hall monitor. The hypocrisy a bitter taste in his mouth, while the old man, Silas, didn't shrug off the guard's hand or even seem to notice it. Sitting there like a rock in the stream of their contempt. Enduring, which Hayes realized was a skill. A form of spiritual armor forged where endurance was the only thing that kept you alive. Knowing he had endured far worse than the prattling of arrogant children. Pain, fear, and loss on a scale they couldn't imagine. That this was nothing, just noise. But for Hayes the noise was deafening, and he had to do something, as he took a half-step forward, just as the sound of a drum cadence echoed from the far end of the quad and the procession arrived. A military color guard marching in perfect unison with flags snapping in the breeze. followed by a flank of university officials and distinguished military guests walking with practiced solemnity. And at the very center of the formation, his chest a constellation of ribbons and medals, was General Marcus Maddox, commander of Special Operations Command, a titan whose reputation was forged in the fires of a dozen shadow wars, the guest of honor and keynote speaker, a four-star deity in the pantheon of modern warfare. And as the procession neared the central plaza, Julian puffed out his chest, eager for the general to witness him handling this unsightly civic problem, as he gestured for Henderson to be more forceful and hissed, "Get him out of here before the general sees this mess." And Henderson, sweating under the pressure, tightened his grip on the old man's shoulder and said, "Come on, old man. Don't make me drag you." And it was at that precise moment that General Maddox, who had been scanning the crowd with a politician's practiced eye, stopped, not just slowing but coming to a dead halt so abruptly that the colonels and aides behind him nearly stumbled into one another. His face moments before a mask of public affability had gone rigid. His eyes sharp and intelligent, locked on the scene at the bench, as a look of stunned disbelief washed over his features, followed by something else entirely. A profound, earth-shattering wave of reverence. And the entire procession ground to a halt as a confused silence fell over the quad, while General Maddox broke from the formation, ignored the university president's questioning look, brushed past a confused trustee, and walked directly toward the bench. His movements no longer ceremonial but deliberate, precise, and charged with an energy that made the air crackle as the crowd parted before him like a force of nature. While Julian, seeing the four-star general approaching, beamed, assuming he had come to thank him for maintaining decorum, standing taller to receive praise. Yet the general's eyes weren't on him and didn't even register his existence, fixed instead with painful intensity on the old man in the tattered coat. As Maddox stopped a few feet from the bench, and Henderson, realizing who stood before him, snatched his hand back from the old man's shoulder like he'd touched a hot stove, while Julian's smug smile faltered into confusion. And for a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath before, in a motion so sharp and perfect it seemed to cut the air, General Maddox snapped to attention and raised his hand in the most precise, powerful salute Captain Hayes had ever seen. Not the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer, but the deeply personal reverent salute of a soldier to a king, holding it rigid with absolute unwavering respect, as silence on the quad became complete, save for the distant flutter of a flag, until the general spoke one quiet word that carried like a thunderclap. Ghost, a word meaningless to most but a confirmation that shook Hayes to his core as the myth became real before his eyes. And Maddox slowly lowered his salute, yet remained rigid at attention as he spoke the name Silas with awe and affection, saying the old man honored them with his presence before turning his glacial gaze to Julian and the guard and asking in a lethal whisper what they thought they were doing, leaving Julian's face bone-white with terror, soundless with fear, as the general turned his booming command voice to the crowd and declared that this man was the reason half of them were alive, that he was Silas Graves, founder and leader of the 1st Special Operations Detachment Vanguard, a unit so secret the records were burned, called Ghosts because they went where no one else could and did what no one else would. The tip of the spear that broke the back of the nation's enemies for 30 years. The source of every doctrine a Green Beret learns, every tactic a SEAL uses, every piece of gear a Ranger carries, and that he carried more confirmed valor in his little finger than the entire crowd. Before locking back onto Julian and stating he had tried to remove him from a bench reserved for him, prompting an audible collective gasp as Julian Croft staggered in utter humiliation, his tailored suit suddenly like a clown costume, while Henderson looked physically ill, and the university president frantically whispered to an aide, as the event was spectacularly derailed and elevated beyond imagination. And finally Silas moved, raising a small placating hand and giving the general a faint weary smile because he wanted no part of recognition, which was a burden not a reward, as he only wished to sit, watch, and remember the faces of the men he had led who never came home, which Maddox understood as he gave an imperceptible nod and directly ordered Captain Hayes to ensure Mr. Graves had whatever he needed and was not disturbed again. To which Hayes replied, "Yes, sir." And after one last look of profound respect, the general strode back to the podium, not to give a speech but to bear witness, as Hayes stood near the bench in silent guardianship while the crowd whispered in awe and shame, later returning with a cold bottle of water and placing it gently beside the old rucksack, earning a single nod from Silas in quiet communion between two generations of warriors. Just as the flyover began with fighter jets roaring overhead in missing man formation, and Silas looked up as a single tear cut a clean path through the dirt on his weathered cheek. A silent salute to the ghosts only he could see. Asterisk.